broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for Andrew Krug's first webcast with us. So we like to say happy time zone because we never really know what time it is where you're from. That brings me into my first thing is we'd love everywhere. To know. Yes, at this point, it's pretty much everywhere, but we'd love to know where you're from. So if you want to share that with us, we'd love to hear it. Today, we're going to be in the live chat channel in the Wild West Hacking Fest Discord. So if you are new to our Hackin cast and aren't on our Discord channel yet, I'm going to go ahead and share the link in the GoToWebinar chat for everybody. This Discord channel is a space that we use for all of our Hackin casts. We use it for our trainings as well. You'll get a private training channel whenever you take one of our training classes. There's also a lot of different channels in there as well for like LinkedIn connection. There's a job board. So it's just.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Deputy.
How are we today? Andrew, you've got your first run of your class at the end of May. And then again, we'll be teaching it again in person in Reno in June. Do you wanna talk about, give us kind of a brief overview of your class?
I've got some slides in the deck that are going to be in this presentation, which are kind of a little bit advertisement for the class that have the dates and also about Way West. But, kind of the preview of the class is that we put you really into the persona of a solo security salary at a brand new company. And that's kind of like the basis of the entire talk is that you are you're the only person working for this consultancy and you're saddled with this shoe store application that you kind of have to evolve and grow and maintain and lock down as the class goes on. And we do that in a bunch of different ways until we get to kind of this ideal state at the end of the class where you can be really, really confident that if the app is breached, you can play Clue and tell the story of how and why. And we put a bunch of guardrails in place to prevent bad stuff from happening, as an attacker kind of moves through the app.
So did your wife decide that it should be a shoe store?
Oh no, the shoe store has been it's kind of like a running joke in my group of friends that like shoe stores are this great example of where business sort of meets security, right? Because like retail is this great example of trade-offs. It's always trade-offs and they're always contracting out and you get saddled with, poor security practices sometimes. And so this has been going on for years. I actually built the first version of the shoe store for reInvent 2018 when I worked at Mozilla. So we had a memory forensics challenge around the store. So I just kind of like took that asset and reused it for the class. I'm grateful to be here. And I think this is a totally unique opportunity too, because you don't see a lot of AWS training courses that use open source, that heavily leverage community tools and talk about real life. There's the concept of what life should be like that we talk about at conferences often. And then there's like what life is really like. And this is going to be very real and practical.
So I want to mention something else. Pre-show banter. I only show up for the pre-show banter. T-shirts are on sale in the Spearfish General Store. Did you get one, Andrew?
I haven't got any Wild West swag. I think the only piece of Black Hills swag that I have is a shirt that Jeff snagged for me like 10 years ago.
Oh, we got to fix that. We got to fix that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sending you a shirt and a Wild West Hackin Fest coin, or at least giving them to you at the conference. One of the two.
Oh, yeah.
When I can hand it to you in person, I cannot wait.
It's one of the original Black Hills shirts that I have with like the sneakers on it. And it says like, so people hire you to break into things so that they make sure that somebody else doesn't break into their things. I don't know if you know this shirt.
I think I do remember that.
That's awesome.
I love that. I love that. Who was it? Somebody said, I think it was Eric Conrad used to say, when his kids asked him what he did, he said, my dad catches bad guys on the internet. And I think Nadine Tanner also, I think that's what her kids ask what her mom does. They do that. So kind of cool stuff. But the t-shirt is available if you're interested. I know the innkeeper, Miss Megan, has hers on today. Shelby, are you wearing yours?
I don't have mine on. I have mine right behind me, though.
Oh, that's close enough.
You should make a little one for your doll. I think that,
For the doll in the back.
yeah,
Yeah,
that would be awesome.
that would be. I'm not sure she'd be happy with me trying to change her outfit, though. She might get mad.
For other pre-show banter enthusiasts, I can say there is in plan a pre-show banter-a-thon happening. This is for real. We are really going to do this. A 24-hour pre-show banter-a-thon as a fundraiser for, I think it's open source tools, or I might be saying that wrong, but that's in planning. That's open because we were talking about it on our last BHIS newscast. So I can spread the news about.
So we have the hour together. I might run a little overtime. I don't know. I put together a lot of content for this Hackin cast. I hope we can keep it conversational. If you could see my desk right now, I've got the slides behind me. I've got the Discord to the right. So I'm going to look at the questions as they're coming in and do my best to kind of like keep this engaging and interactive and live, because I think the hardest thing for virtual presentations is knowing if you're there and knowing that you're listening and that you have questions. So I see lots of great chat coming in. Hello, friends. This is the chat. We're on the air. So we'll just kick it off here. So this is the Hackin cast for Foundations of Cloud Security and why they're challenging to implement. So I'm Andrew Krug. This is a bunch of stuff about me. There's my email and my Twitter. Worked at a bunch of places. I have like 15 years in IT stuff and the last 5 or 6 or so in AWS Cloud Security and Identity and Access Management. In my spare time, I like to drive tractors around my farm, build fences. Happy to take questions on hay farming or fence building at the end, if that's something you're interested in. I work at Datadog right now as a technical evangelist, and I speak a lot on behalf of Datadog, but today is not one of those days. This is a personal brand builder, and so anything that you see here is not representative of what Datadog thinks about the cloud. It's what I think about the cloud, and I have a lot of experience dealing with the cloud. Like everybody mentioned, I am teaching the very first run of my Cloud Security Boot Camp, Securing the Cloud Foundations. Hopefully it's going to be the first in a series of courses about securing the cloud. So hopefully this is just going to be the foundation. Somebody asked what animals I have. I have horses, dogs, cats, and hay. So happy to talk more about that later, but do check the course out. There's a little promo there to sign up for it. So today we're going to talk about these 3 things. And I love to do the 3 takeaways for the talk. I learned to do this a long time ago. 1 is learn what I mean when I say fundamentals of cloud security. That can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So let's put some definition around that. We're going to understand some of the attack surface area of AWS in particular, but some of these things do apply generically to all clouds. And you're going to get some recommendations and kind of a preview of what we're going to teach in the upcoming course. But again, we only have the hour together, so we can't cover a ton. Some of this is going to feel really fast or too broad. But if you have questions, do follow up with me. So first, before we get into this, a little bit of information or inspiration, not information, inspiration. I started my journey as a cloud security engineer back in 2015, 2016. And I was just hanging out, watching talks on YouTube because I was part of a startup that had just been acquired. And, sometimes you have a lot of free time after that. And I ran across some very cool talks from some folks by the name of Beetle Bailey and Josh Dulac. And I thought that the thing that they were presenting, which was security automation at the time, was pretty darn cool. And so I decided that I was going to make that my life, right? And I was going to learn the crazy thing that they call the AWS Cloud. And I pitched a talk to Black Hat for an idea that I had that was totally not even done. And they accepted it, which was the best thing in the world and the worst thing in the world, because I had to actually make stuff then for that talk. And it kind of just evolved into this whole 6-year-long story arc. And so kind of the thing to take away here is if you're interested in this and you want to put the time in, like, you can do cloud stuff. I think there's a perception that there's a barrier here that really isn't real. It's about just spending the time, and you can learn this discipline, specialized discipline of security, and you can do it too. Because there's so many problems to solve. The cloud space is really, really big, right? In fact, it's growing right now. And there's tons of gaps in tooling, documentation, and you can actually change the world. Oh, Jeff McJunkin, another friend of mine, says, "Oh crap, they accepted my talk. Now I actually have to make this thing." That was the moment. That was the moment. And that is how you change the world. It's by overpromising something and then you have to build it. And I think there's also a perception in cloud stuff that you have to be an excellent programmer. Like, you have to come from a CS background or software development background. And I can honestly tell you, when I was in school, I was the worst programmer in the world. And I am a recovering sysadmin who has learned to be a software developer to help people solve problems. So if that's you, you're in the right place, because I empathize with the way that you see the world. And you can inspire a lot of folks. So on this slide, and I've never made a slide like this for any other talk I've ever given, are my AWS heroes. After I watched that first talk that kind of inspired me to do my thing and get involved with cloud stuff, I kept watching talks from people like Loic Simon, the author of Scout Suite, from Bridget Johnson, Tony Della Fuente, Henrik Johansson, Scott Piper, and all the folks really on this slide. And I worked with these people. I reached out to them. And they're my heroes, not just because they're thought leaders or tool creators or InfoSec celebrities. It's because when I reached out to them, they wrote me back. And I was nobody. So you can reach out to all these folks, any of the folks really in the community. And I don't think that there's anybody that's kind of so far out there that they're not going to write you back and try to collaborate with you. And that includes me. We had a question come in: does AWS have a free tier? Absolutely, they do have a free tier. That's well documented. I'm happy to talk more about that at the end. All these people have this thing in common, which is that they see lots of problems in the work that they do. They either work at a company of substantial scale, or they work in a diverse enough set of problems that they kind of can see the forest through the trees, and then they try to solve those problems. And often they're hard problems, foundational problems, fundamental problems that aren't easy to solve, but they just kind of go to work. And they share those solutions back with the community. And here is linked that very first presentation that kind of inspired me. So the first step for you, if you're thinking, hey, this sounds super, super interesting to me, is that you could submit a tool to the WWHF Conference tool shed. I happen to know one of the organizers, happens to be me. You don't have to be a tool creator to submit to the WWHF tool shed. You could be a tool advocate, somebody that just knows how to use a tool really well, like Burp Suite or Bloodhound or any of these things that we use for pen testing. You can be a tool contributor and submit to the WWHF tool shed. I would love to help. If you are not confident presenting, please do reach out to me and I will help you put a presentation together. And we could use more submissions. There's the link, just came into the Discord chat. So please definitely do submit tools. We'd love to have you come to WWHF in person or virtually and share your tool that you use to do security stuff. That's 16 to 18 of June this year. The deadline is April 30th to submit. So back to this fundamentals thing. So this is about cloud security fundamentals. I think the best way to define fundamentals of cloud security is actually to give you some examples of fundamentals for other things. So in baseball, we have hitting, fielding, and pitching. And in music, we have pitch, scale, and rhythm. Somebody in the chat actually mentioned that I'm also a saxophonist. So music fundamentals are near and dear to me, less the sports ball. But I was inspired a long time ago by somebody who gave a really good talk on baseball fundamentals as they relate to cloud security. And that was the same guy, Beetle Bailey. And he talked a lot about one of the greatest hitters ever, Ted Williams. and that he was recognized for being the last player to average 400 in a batting season, which means that 40% of the time when he stepped up to the plate, he hit a home run. And he was the last person ever to do that. And we talked about this back at Reinforce 2019 in a security leadership track. And Ted Williams had this great quote, which was that baseball is the only field of endeavor where a man can be successful 3 times out of 10 and be considered a good performer. Just think about that. If you were only successful 30% of the time in InfoSec, would you be considered to be one of the greats at your job? In our fundamentals, in order to master our craft, we have to be successful a great deal more than 30% of the time. If I got some of the baseball nuances incorrect, it's because I do not follow the baseball. But the analogy holds true, and there is the talk if you actually want to go watch it. How do we define greatness, though? The fundamentals of cloud security. So for AWS in particular, there's this thing called the well-architected framework. And the well-architected framework defines kind of operational excellence across a variety of areas. Identity and access, detection, infrastructure protection, data protection, and incident response being the ones that relate to security in particular. We can look at these as kind of the pillars of how we do cloud security. The cloud is a big place. So at the time of crafting this presentation, there are about 175 different products in the AWS product portfolio. They have lots of super confusing names like AWS Systems Manager, Session Manager. And if you follow folks like Corey Quinny Pig on Twitter, he's always got some comment on AWS product names. And there's various and sundry ways to misconfigure these products. Either they are insecure by default, they launch in a way that allows you to onboard really, really quickly, or they have nuances about specific products that make them very, very hard to secure. Because the goal of the cloud platform is to provide value to the business first and foremost, and security very, very second. So this might sound scary, right? Like this is a lot of attack surface, and it sounds a bit gloomy as far as what we might be able to do about it. But we can look to the past like good historians. We can look at all the famous data breaches that have happened over the last 5 to 6 years or so, and we can kind of use them as a guiding light to see some themes about where we should focus fundamentals, right? You've got a different range of company sizes here in these famous data breaches and a variety of outcomes as far as the consequences go. But we're going to walk through these. We're going to see that there's a lot of commonality here. Big company, small company, et cetera. They all kind of have some of the same issues. And I'm burying a little bit of the lead here for this next part of the presentation. But let's just go take a look real quick at these breaches as to what happened and some of the lessons we could have learned with regard to fundamentals. People talk a lot about this one back in 2014, the Code Spaces breach, which was probably one of the very first famous AWS access key leaks to GitHub, where somebody leaked a very privileged access key pair to GitHub in the open, and an attacker got hold of that, then basically went into the account and just decided it would be fun to delete all of the instances and all of the data for the business. And of course, they didn't have a backup in any way because there was a belief back in 2014 times, hey, if I'm in the cloud, I don't really have to worry about security. The cloud provider does security for me. This was super, super not true. Some of the lessons that we learned from that was that access keys are pretty much the same as long-lived passwords, right? So any long-lived credential, whether it's a username, password, or an access key pair, if it's long-lived, it's just about as damaging. Incident response needs to take into account cloud-native tactics, which was that the attackers pivoted into the account and then they used persistence mechanisms to kind of hang out and stay in the account, and they didn't really have a backup strategy. There's nothing earth-shattering or groundbreaking there. It's just a really sad story. Then shoot forward a little tiny bit here to the famous Uber data breach, where hackers stole data for 57 million customers, which was primarily personally identifiable information, riot information, et cetera. Same kind of story, different day, except that the access key pair was stored on a private Git server that had a vulnerability, where attackers got access keys, they used them to exfiltrate data, and then that data, of course, affected 57 million customers. What's kind of interesting about this is that Uber was a relatively large company at the time. They had a good detection strategy according to their postmortem for the incident. The initial incursion was detected, but no one was actually looking at the alerts. And there was a pattern of internal incidents for the same system where this Git server would kind of like come up and go unpatched. And then, it would be quite a bit of time before the patches came. And I would call that a fundamentals failure. Even Tesla, a company as big and with as deep a pockets as Tesla, fell vulnerable to an AWS breach earlier in the last 5 years, which resulted in Bitcoin mining and corporate espionage. And this came about because attackers leveraged a Kubernetes console that was open to the world suddenly due to a dropped firewall rule. And that console had, once again, a static access key pair in it. And that access key pair was overly permissive. It allowed folks to launch instances, Bitcoin mining, and also spying. What was kind of interesting about this one was even though there's a metadata service on instances that run in the cloud, Tesla had an additional set of access keys buried in Kubernetes that would normally be for outside of the cloud access. And that's what the attackers leveraged. In addition, this happened in their dev and test environment, where security controls were a bit more lax than their production environment, but the attacker was still able to use these environments to pivot to substantial parts of the business. And that was pretty devastating for Tesla. They also used different detection evasion techniques actually to hide in the account and persist a bit longer than they normally would have been able to by just kind of understanding how Tesla was doing detection and response. Lots of folks are pointing out that there is a pattern here to this. And that brings us to the second most recent, which is the Capital One breach, which we won't spend a ton of time on because it's like the solar winds of last year. We've probably all been to a webinar at this point about Capital One's data breach, or potentially like more than half of us were victims of the Capital One data breach. This one is interesting because it is the first one in the line not to use long-lived credentials. It was a misconfiguration in actually a security tool that allowed an attacker to get an SSRF on a box and exfiltrate temporary tokens. So those temporary tokens, even though they're short-lived, they're usually good for about 15 minutes, they were able to be used to exfiltrate data because they were overly privileged and could read data that, yes, somebody pointed out, that was only last year. Capital One data breach was just last year. They were able to use those exfiltrated credentials to access a substantial amount of customer data. And this was interesting because this was a non-cloud native product that allowed the attacker to get credentials in the first place. That was due to this SSRF pivot to the local host metadata server. Credentials for the instance were overly permissive. So not only did we have this misconfiguration and then kind of overly broad IAM policy, but the detection capabilities of Capital One was also not adequate to detect and prevent the breach in a timely manner. So we sort of see this perfect storm creating this security incident. So are you seeing any themes here? I mean, a couple of folks have called this out in the chat already, which is that from 2014 to now, many of these incidents that were devastating were very similar. They were access key leaks, they were misconfiguration, and they inconsistently applied and practiced those 5 fundamentals that we saw on the slide about the well-architected framework. So we can even take those and distill them down to older security principles. So these are from the Mozilla list of security principles that was published in 2011 that call out things like least privilege and 2FA as a means of securing systems, along with things like defense in depth strategies. These weren't likely consistently applied to all these cases. Also things like understanding how the underlying system works and keeping the design of systems simple. These security principles I still tend to refer back to as a guiding light because I think there's a perception that because the business can go faster in the cloud, we must go as fast as we can go. That wasn't necessarily true back in the day when it took like 6 months to requisition a server and you had to get 3 bids and yada, yada, yada. But now we can do things really, really quickly, which means that oftentimes we skip reviews or we skip fundamental understanding of how things work, and that kind of results in fewer security controls, data breaches, risky behavior, etc. Yes, you cannot secure what you don't understand. 100%. 2015, when I started this journey talking about cloud security at Black Hat, I was talking about leaked access keys, permissive IAM, and misconfiguration. What do you think we'll add to the 2021 list? We really only add SSRF to that 2021 list. They're almost exactly the same. So that's interesting to me as a data point when I went and I looked back at my 2015 slide decks and creating this course in 2021, we're really having a lot of the same issues. So what does this tell you? What does it tell you? You can't secure what you don't understand. Somebody put moves to Kubernetes. You don't need it. You don't need the Kubernetes. I swear. Are these problems just unsolvable? No, they're not. They're not unsolvable. They're fundamental failures. And even in 2015, we had the controls that we needed in order to prevent these types of data breaches. And I liken this to this quote from Kelly Shortridge, which is that InfoSec is grieving that companies will never be invulnerable to attack, which I think is true, that we're still here. Companies think that they won't be invulnerable to attack, ... if they're in the cloud. I would put us probably in the 5 stages of InfoSec grief in the bargaining stage, which is that we think if we just spend enough money on security products, we can probably stop the attacks from happening. But what we really need is to better understand the system that we're working with and the set of controls and guardrails that we have access to. There's the Red Pill of Resilience talk. It's one of my personal favorites. It's linked at the bottom of the slide as well. We're trying to get to here, which is that we accept that we are vulnerable to attack regardless of whether in data center, cloud, etc. And we should do whatever we can to make it as annoying and expensive for an attacker to leverage our cloud assets to do bad things. To me, that looks like a lot like modern AppSec, right? Which is baking security into every step of the application development lifecycle. So taking it back to that list of 179 products, we need to do risk assessment, threat modeling, and apply guardrails to everything that we're doing in AWS. And that starts with kind of leaning into those principles, because the technology is better than it's ever been. So in 2015, we didn't have the tools that we do today. We could still have solved these problems, but we didn't have the visibility. We didn't have the extra access management conditions that we do now. Like, we have more tools, more technology than we've ever had. So my assertion is that this is hard because these are social problems. And also because fundamental security, foundational security is not interesting. It's not as interesting as going and buying an expensive product that does whatever crazy ML anomaly detection, etc., that you can go and get off the shelf. It's more important to actually change your workplace culture and put these checks and balances into the way that you are doing development. Do whatever you can to ensure that people can't do these things, but when they do, you're prepared to handle them. So every year, Palo Alto puts out this report, a State of Cloud Native Security report, just to put some hard facts around it. This is data from last year's Palo Alto State of Cloud Native Security report, which was that 46% of enterprises are running workloads in the cloud. A lot of them were looking to head to 64% within 24 months. They cited employee training on security tools and employee training on security practices to be the 2 top of mind challenges for cloud native security. And only 18% of those companies surveyed were confident in their cloud security posture. That makes me sad, just like the cloud have made us cry. Only 18%, that's not very many folks of those large enterprises that are running workloads in the cloud are confident in their security posture. So what do we need? We need training and tools. We need training and tools For the staff, we need tools that make security automation, shift left, etc., simpler. So don't forget, we have the boot camp coming up, which literally is training and tools. Sad but good for job security. Yes, that is one of the primary reasons why you should say, yes, we can, because this is a field with negative unemployment. So let's just highlight a few things. So when we go back to those well-architected principles that we talked about earlier in the slide deck, I bet you're already good at 2 of these because you do them all the time in your data center or wherever you run workloads now. I bet you're basically good at infrastructure protection and data protection. So we're not going to talk about those things today, frankly, because we don't have time to talk about all 5 principles in the well-architected framework. We're going to talk about identity and access, which is a huge part of cloud security and hardening. We're going to talk about detection, knowing when something is wrong, and also auditing. And we're going to talk about incident response, which is really the acknowledgement that some days, regardless of how many guardrails we have, etc., we're going to screw up and it's going to be a bad day. But the better we are prepared to kind of deal with that, the better time we're going to have. Me and my friend Nathan Case, who will come up on another slide, we like to call it doing your best on your worst day on the job. And in cloud, incident response can be a nightmare if you're not set up for it. So let's talk about the biggest area probably of attack surface, which is IAM, identity and access management. So whether you want to admit it or not, if you're in any cloud, IAM controls the control plane. And the control plane is what governs who can do what inside of your entire cloud environment. And because it's cloud, the control plane is all about APIs. So on screen here, you see kind of an example of just a simple call to an API to do something as basic as create a blob store S3 bucket to store some files. So we make a sign request with some access keys, send that to a service endpoint. The service endpoint does the work requested, returns a response code. Easy enough, right? The terms that we need to remember from that is that we have a credential, which is who, or the principal. We have an API request, which is the what, and we have a service endpoint, which is what thing are we interacting with, and then on the left is what API verbs are we using to interact with that. IAM is probably one of the least understood and most powerful facilities in AWS. And it's all governed by policy. So when you sign up for an AWS account, you make the first user the quote unquote root account user, which sometimes it ends up being the same user in startups as they use for Amazon shopping accounts. And that's terrifying because it can do everything. But then after that, if you follow any of the basic guides, you start to delegate that access away. And the way you delegate the access is to create policy. And that policy is broken up into these statements that follow this PARC acronym, which is the principal who's doing the thing, what is the action that they're doing, or the IAM verbs, what resource can they do it to, and when can they do that, the conditions under which those statements are true. And they default to implicit deny, but we can mix and match allow and deny conditions inside of a policy. So what's new here since 2015, when I started talking about all this, is these condition keys. So there were very, very few conditions way back when. Condition keys are incredibly powerful because we can start to do things like segment off what users can do what to what resources based on understanding metadata about the users themselves. So things like attribute-based access control, things that come from a single sign-on provider, from an Okta or an Auth0, and we can use this to really, truly harden our policies to least privilege. This is a grossly simplified version of what an access decision flow looks like in AWS. They have a diagram that's publicly available on the doc site, which is actually in the slides I provided in the PDF that shows that full flow. But what you need to know is that a principal requests from a service checks a statement is evaluated, and then an access decision is made inside of the access decision facility that is AWS IAM. Somebody pointed out that Becky Weiss of AWS, who's a senior principal engineer, has some great reInvent videos on this. Yes, she does. Becky Weiss is on the My Heroes slide as well. And there's going to be one more coming up. So stay tuned for a talk recommendation if you want to be an IAM policy expert. In that decision shape that we just talked about, AWS IAM makes decisions in the following order. It first evaluates the IAM policy, like the one I just showed you, against the principal making the call. These default to deny unless there's an allow condition. So it looks at the conditions after that, under what condition should that allow be true, and then if it's not true, it will return a deny condition. Then it looks at the organization level controls, which if you don't know what these are, stay with me. We're going to talk about security control policies and what an AWS organization is in just a minute. And that can return a deny after an allow. So think of that as like kind of a safety umbrella, safety net for IAM policies and conditions that can be enforced for any account that's part of paying. But then we have this last condition, which is by far and away the hardest one, which is that there is another IAM language called resource-based policies, which are the policies that attach to things like S3 buckets, SNS topics, SQS queues, and Lambda functions, and those can actually return an allow after everything else has denied. So there's a lot of complexity here in the decision-making flow. So we have to really, really understand the identity and access model. Some folks point out that this is like RBAC, and there was a question on security groups and SCPs. Stay with me, we're going to get there on the SCPs and resource-based policies and how they're different from network security groups. So here's one of my favorite talks, which is how you can become an IAM policy expert by Bridget Johnson. I especially love Bridget Johnson's talks because she is also a fellow equestrian fan of horses and unicorns and uses them in all of her IAM examples. And Bridget is just a great, entertaining public speaker. So if you want to take 60 minutes after this and go become an IAM policy expert, you can watch Bridget's talk from reInvent. But let's talk about those conditions, right? So as we build this pyramid up, back in 2015, all we had were those IAM verbs and allow and deny. But then later on, we got these cool conditions that we could play with, which was things like, was the multi-factor auth age less than or greater than a certain number of seconds? So that's very, very cool if we want super privileged actions to force a user to re-MFA. And I just want that to stick with you, because as soon as we bring MFA into the picture, we start to really shut down the blast radius for leaked credentials, right? Because the leaked credential is only as good as the token it was generated from using MFA. So if we have static access key pair, we can go through a flow that takes a long-lived token, generates a short-lived token with MFA, and you can't do anything with the original key pair without the second factor credential. And that's great for developer access. We can also use condition keys that start to do things like correlate usernames or strict naming conventions with the location of resources. So we can create folders, paths, etc. in AWS, and we can really build ourselves this strong bastion that matches users, groups, team names. And we can start to use job roles, which I think is probably the most powerful, where you can say things like, if this user is part of an operations team, they have more superpowers than that user by just annotating the user with metadata or tags. So yes, somebody did just point out, don't forget fun with attribute-based, tag-based access control, which is literally that condition that we're calling out right there at the bottom of slide number 58. So beyond that, we also have things like being able to restrict the actual assumption of a role. And I like to think of this as like putting on a hat that gives you superpowers, assuming a role, where your hat says the job that you're going to go do. So it's like a hard hat that says foreman or a hard hat that says construction worker. And we can actually make sure in the trust chain that somebody is assuming that role using their role session name. So we know who a user is because that has to map back to their username. So if you have a strong naming convention, you can tie that back to Andrew.Krug as the role session name, and it can ensure that that role is only assumable using a second factor device. So you see how we kind of are building this bastion of identity by creating all of these conditions that make the access decision true. And that's very, very cool from a hardening perspective, because it means that we can start to do bold things like assume that we can leak our access keys without any consequences. And that shuts down the majority of data breaches that we saw on the screen. So is this getting your wheels turning? Are you still with me? Does this sound super confusing? If it does, we're going to spend about a day and a half on just identity and access in the class over the course of the 4 days. I hope you're thinking about how you can lock down in your environment if you're in an existing AWS reality now, that there are some very real guardrails you can go back and apply. There's more than this. There's a thing now called AWS Permissions Boundaries. And this may sound a lot like IAM for your IAM. Just let that sink in for a second. And it's an extra set of definable conditions that provide a set of guardrails for your AWS policies. This might sound a little bit like belt and suspenders, but I promise it's not. We're actually going to get to the belt and suspenders part. This is actually a policy grammar that I like to think of as making the cloud smaller. Somebody asked, is there a tool to help build out policies? AWS UI is about the best tool to build out policies, and it has a nice point and clicky wizard. But these permissions boundaries do things like restrict to certain regions or source IPs. So I constantly, in the work that I do, I get asked, hey, Andrew, like, how can I make the set of stuff that I have to audit less? Because a lot of things in AWS you have to do by region. So AWS Permissions Boundaries, the simplest use case that I can communicate to you is restrict it to a certain region. We can start to do things like this. We can say that the maximum permission that can ever exist for a given role is these verbs. This is a permissions boundary. And it describes those actions. So we have the same things from the park statement that we had earlier, but we also have a new set of condition keys. And that condition in this case is string equals requested region EU Central 1, which now just took our possible set of permissions and it reduced the surface area of that from 80 plus regions to just one. What I can do as an administrator is I can create a policy that says any developer can create a role and they can do whatever they want with that role, as long as they attach a permissions boundary to it. And that permissions boundary can be the maximum potential policy. So the developer can go and they can put ***, or they can be super reckless, and I can make sure that there's a guardrail at the account level. But what if we have a rogue administrator in an account? And that's where AWS Organizations comes into play. And the truth is, AWS Organizations doesn't apply only to enterprises. It's pretty much free to turn on. It's the evolution of AWS's consolidated billing model. We used to be able to have multiple accounts roll up to a single billing account. And in any company, regardless of how many employees you have or your size, you're probably going to end up with multiple AWS accounts, because you want to have a development, you want to have a staging, you want to have a production, and you want to let people do different things in them. The best blast radius control is still multiple accounts. Because if an attacker breaches your dev, they only breach your dev. If they breach your staging, they only breach your staging. And AWS Organizations is the means by which we leverage multi-account to be effective, because it also gives centralized governance. On top of that, though, in addition to just being totally easy to turn on and rolling up the bills, we have a bunch of benefits, which is that we get things like the account vending machine, where we can have a one button click to roll out accounts with our blueprint, our roles, our standards, and we can sort of pave the road for new applications to come in to an organization and have these dedicated accounts without a lot of overhead. So in the securing the cloud class, we actually use this to roll out a production account, development account, and a security tools account for running security and forensics operation and being kind of a logs bastion. And that's very, very fun. Another great benefit of AWS Organizations versus just having a bunch of disparate accounts is that if you are the admin of AWS Organizations and you want access for IR, you want access to push out roles, you have that. There is no longer root accounts that you have to safeguard for every single one of your use cases in your company. So whether you have 1 or 100 accounts, they all look the same. They all log the same. They can all be subject to the same policies for auditing, logging, security at a top level. And that policy is easily shareable. And on top of that, you get these security control policies. Somebody asked a great question about Control Tower. I'm going to answer that in just a minute. So with AWS Organizations, you can do all these things, like you can turn on CloudTrail for all your accounts. You can turn on Guard Duty for all your accounts. And then you can use these security control policies to even make the cloud even smaller than permissions boundaries. So SCP might sound similar to permissions boundaries, but it's really one more level up of safeguards. It's like a belt and suspenders for your permissions boundaries that exists beyond another IAM boundary. So it is proverbial belt and suspenders, but it's really, really useful. What can we do here? We can make these SCPs, security control policies, and we can socialize them, and we can say what's possible inside of our organization and not. We can lock down the access to that or put it through a CI/CD pipeline so it has +1 reviewer and have this really strong set of top-level policies. And after that, we have all kinds of fun. We can start to do things like stop users from stopping monitoring. So back in 2015, we used to talk a lot about disrupting CloudTrail. Like that was the golden thing that everybody would demonstrate at Black Hat and at red team conferences and stuff. It's like, oh, I can get in and I can sort of disrupt CloudTrail in all these different ways. Well, at the SCP level now, we can actually stop people from having access to those API verbs that allow them to do things like stop logging. So we don't need dead man alarms anymore. We don't need security automations to go back and turn on all the logging facilities. This is the next level of that. We can restrict regions that people have access to by service. So we could start to use things like IAM policy verb not action. And we could say, I'm going to turn off all these regions for all these services that are not these. And by doing that, we get a bonus side effect, which is that when AWS rolls out a brand new whiz-bang service that does XYZ, it's not actually available to all your accounts until it has a security review and you go back in and you add an exception. We can restrict instance sizing to known good sizes. So if there's only 2 or 3 different EC2 instance sizes we use, we can already do things like prevent a big incident when there's a leaked access key that results in Bitcoin mining because they won't be able to launch really expensive instances. You can also use that for governance, like keep costs low, et cetera, et cetera. But really, all these things are just making the cloud smaller. So we really can do least privilege. This is a lot of information that really says you can get to this place where you can do least privilege, you can put guardrails on, and you can live in this reality where you're actually spending some time on your IAM roles. Before we move on, though, I just want to show real quick a new feature that was just released. I think it was like this quarter. AWS has a new feature now that was in a bunch of different products, which is, I lost my session, short-lived sessions with MFA. All right, there we are, back in. All right, so what this does is it does the same thing as a tool called Aardvark and RepoKid that Netflix developed a long time ago, which would actually go and look at the API calls in CloudTrail that a role makes, and then it would craft a role for it that was the absolute least privileged role. And this is kind of a case, I think, that's totally awesome because open source has driven the development of these product features, which is that now you can actually create a role that's super, super permissive, let something run for a while, and then you can go into that role, scroll all the way down, and you can say, generate me a role policy using CloudTrail data. So if you click this button, it takes about a half an hour to run, but it'll go back over a sliding window, and then it will generate an IAM policy that is only the things that role used. So we can actually come in here and we can see that this role used these 4 services, and then we can whitelist them. We can be a little bit more granular, and evaluate these one at a time, but it will actually spit out a role using the UI, which I think is the coolest thing that then we can put in CI/CD. That's the subset of actual actions that principal took using CloudTrail data. So I think that's very, very cool. Back to the slides. And we have lots of great tooling. Somebody asked, is there a way to extend the life of an IAM session with MFA? There absolutely is a way to extend the life of an IAM session with MFA. It's an attribute of the role itself. It can be up to 12 hours. So I think it defaults to 1 hour, which is 3,600 seconds. And you can extend it actually to 12 if you like, at your own risk. So lots of great tooling. SCP policy generator is out there on asecure.cloud. I use this all the time to go through and mash up those security control policies. I also use this tool all the time, which is a Scott Piper tool, who was also on my slide of AWS Heroes, which is Parliament for IAM linting. You can put this in CI/CD, and then you can reject certain things based on whether they pass linting or not. And that's very, very handy. So, the future is really trying to put more of this stuff in CI/CD, right? And letting less of it actually get to production so that we have to audit it. But we know that, we can't prevent 100% of it. So we need kind of both approaches. We need tools in CI/CD, and we need auditing in dev staging, production of the actual accounts. So did we prevent all the breaches that we talked about earlier in the session? Yes, we absolutely did. So we made the leaked access keys unusable via enforcing MFA, enforcing policy conditions. We controlled the blast radius of different key leaks via permissions boundaries. In the case of open security groups, and somebody did ask a question about security groups, because a lot of these breaches were ACLs that got dropped or temp ACLs that got added. My advice, stop giving developers or even admins the ability to create security groups outside of CI/CD. Like, make some use cases for security groups like HTTPS web servers, SSH from a Bastion host. Put those through CI/CD, and don't let people make security groups. Use SCPs to lock that down. And if you need troubleshooting or break glass access, restrict that to a VPN or Bastion. They're pretty easy. But you have to think about that. Somebody did say also consider using federated authentication. That is day 4 of securing the cloud, as we do set up single sign-on flows, federated auth, etc. for AWS. We didn't have time to go through it today. So we can't really percent of effective controls are going to prevent 100% of mistakes. Some mistakes are going to find a way in. And this is the part, where if I was on top of it, I would make some joke about Jurassic Park and life finds a way, mistakes will find a way. And you would laugh if we were in person. It would be funny. We would share a moment and move on. We can't do that virtually. So these are some of my favorite auditing tools for auditing for mistakes. We're going to look at the one in bold, which is Duo Labs Cloudmapper. All of these are great open source tools. And then there's AWS Config, which is the cloud native thingy. But I like the open source tools because they tend to be a little bit more flexible if you need to put in custom checks and custom audits. So why do I like Cloudmapper? Cloudmapper is a Scott Piper tool. If you're a fan of Scott Piper, he does great work, super active in the community. He does a great job curating his projects. His findings are really, really actionable and practical. The reports are super shiny. So you can hand them to your dev teams, you can hand them to your boss, you can hand them to a lawyer. They look great. You can run this on a schedule, and it has great support for AWS organizations. It's also super lightweight. The way that Cloudmapper gathers data about an AWS account is just using bash commands. And we can all understand bash commands, right? If you're not a developer, you can go in there and you can actually see that he's just running the AWS CLI, dumping out JSON, and then crunching that JSON after it's all been gathered. which means that you can write new checks on the fly without having to go back and like regather all this JSON, and super, super helpful for audits or hardening assessments. I use this all the time. I've used this for hundreds and hundreds of accounts. It's an amazing tool, super extensible, great community. So if we were to take it for a spin, we could run it on a local system using admin credentials or security audit role. If we wanted to be really, really least privilege, it would go and pull the entire AWS organization, iterate over every account. You can also run it in Fargate, which is a container thingy that will run it every day and kind of continuously audit the state of your account. It does take a bit of time to run. So if you have hundreds of accounts, it takes 25 to 30 minutes per account because it's going out there and it's really crawling every region and getting the state of every service and dumping it out to JSON that then it goes and evaluates. At the end, though, you get a super, super nice looking report. And let me just kind of show you what those actually look like. This is my starting point for hardening assessments when I do consulting work. It breaks out resource counts by type, breaks out resource counts by region. So you might have some surprises here if you're like, I don't have anything in EU Central 1, but all of a sudden I have EU Central 1 resources. It goes through all of the IAM resources, and it gives you Parliament style findings for IAM linting, and it categorizes them based on severity. So it's super, super handy for just kind of like getting a high level view of what the most severe issues are account by account. And then it gives you actually actionable feedback as far as how to go and address those. There are some noisy findings, but they're suppressible. You can kind of create your own whitelist for suppressing the things that you don't want to see. And it has a Slack bot integration as well. I'm not going to show you today, but we talk about it in the Securing the Cloud course. It will catch all these IAM common mistakes, which I think is very cool. So anytime that you make aggressive use of stars in policies, which match on all kinds of conditions, it'll call those out. I see people do this all the time to this day, where they'll try to match based on naming conventions using star. They think that S3:get star means only read verbs, and it doesn't always necessarily mean that. So it catches all these kind of anti-patterns. It catches YOLO policies, overly permissive policies, where somebody is granted too many permissions to somebody for a single bucket, a single resource, etc. So with tools like Cloudmapper, AWS Config, you really can catch most misconfigurations as long as you're continuously running audits. How well does Securing the Cloud course map over into GCP? 100% of the stuff we're going to talk about is AWS centric, but the principles are relatively the same. How fluent in AWS do I need to be to do the training in May or June? Not at all. It's designed for people with zero cloud experience. You need only have Bash and Linux experience. So final pillar, 4 minutes to go. We're going to talk about detection and response, showing up, doing your best, worst day. How do we do IR at scale? Hopefully, if you're doing IR, you're following this flow: prepare, investigate, respond, recover. We all know that sometimes we skip that prepare step. So sometimes we investigate, respond, recover. I've got a lot of material out there on this already. If you're interested in run books and playbooks for AWS, there's a great talk I did with Nathan Case at reInvent a couple years ago. But this all starts with logs and preparedness with regard to your logs. People talk a lot about CloudTrail. In the course, we're going to set up a multi-account CloudTrail using AWS Organizations, and we're going to sync that to a write once, read many account in order to guarantee the lifecycle integrity of those logs. And we're going to pull those into AWS Athena, and you're going to get this great incident response cheat sheet for using Athena to analyze CloudTrail. We're also going to talk about things that you wouldn't normally talk about in an AWS class, like how to JSONify Nginx logs and send those to CloudWatch and then correlate them with CloudTrail logs. And the end result will be that you have this shoe store app that's kind of running. You have JSON logs for, you have CloudTrail logs for, and we're also going to pull in things like VPC flow logs. So like the equivalent of NetFlow for AWS VPCs. And we're going to prove out a whole bunch of theories with regard to like IOCs and malwares, etc. And we're going to pull in logs like Route 53 logging, which is technically free, but it's another off by default option in AWS. And we're going to look at those in depth as well to detect things like the SolarWinds breach. So we don't have time to look at the cooking show version of this because we're 58 minutes in, slide 97 of 99, and I want to take the time to answer a few questions in the chat. But what do we just see in this 1 hour long wild ride through some of the fundamentals? We saw cloud incidents are not much different over the last 5 years. By changing a few of the defaults in the account, we can avoid some of the most common and also, I would add, most devastating breaches of the last 5 years. And for the more interesting incidents, we can prepare and we can log all the data that we need in order to respond effectively. Somebody says I should cover Azure and Google. Definitely let me know if you're interested in that content. So I've done a bunch of Azure and GCP stuff over the years. It's just most folks are interested in AWS. Don't forget to register for Securing the Cloud online or at Way West Hackin Fest in person if you want to hang out. There's a great dinner. There's going to be pizza. It's going to be a blast in Reno, beautiful Sparks. You can tweet at me at Andrew Krug, or you can send me email if you're not on Twitter. Happy to talk. There's a couple of questions. If I have a separate SIM, is it better to ship logs to that or to leave logs in the cloud and alert from multiple locations? So if you have a SIM, you probably have it because you like it, I hope, and you want to send logs there and you want to write alerts there. So yes, if you have a SIM and you like it, use your SIM. For someone with effectively zero AWS knowledge, is it worth going through the training AWS has created? AWS has a lot of great foundational training out there and available. It's about the time commitment. So like I said, the class is designed to take you from zero cloud experience or data center only to perfectly adequate at cloud. So I would recommend the 4-day course because it's only 4 4-hour sessions and you're going to touch a lot of stuff. If one is interested in your correlation of Nginx with CloudTrail, do you have any blogs on that type of analysis? No, I haven't written a blog post on it because I literally made it for the Securing the Cloud class just a couple of weekends ago. Can you still do MFA and use Terraform? Absolutely, yes, you can. In the Securing the Cloud course, I'm going to show you how to create the roles and use open source tool called 99 Signals AWS Vault to generate temporary session tokens for Terraform. How do you feel about right to repair as someone who farms? The whole John Deere stuff going on. I only have old tractors. All my tractors are pre-John Deere and DRM on tractors. I probably will never buy a new tractor. Does limiting permissions and privileges translate well to erecting fences? Absolutely it does. I have outer fence and inner perimeter fence. Are misconfigurations as common in Azure and other cloud environments as well? Absolutely. I think they are 100% as common in Azure and other cloud environments because they are equally easy to mess up. Cloudmapper versus AWS Security Hub. So I think that these actually serve very different needs, right? AWS Security Hub is an aggregator and Cloudmapper is a finding generator. So it stands to reason that Cloudmapper could feed into a tool like AWS Security Hub for workflow, and AWS Security Hub would aggregate the findings from that, just like it aggregates findings from config or guard duty or whatever. Any blog or YouTube channel recommendation for AWS security? Not one in particular. Like I said, I live on old reInvent talks. I still find stuff from reInvent talks even 2, 3, 4 years ago that is relevant to me today. Just my 2 cents, I encourage CloudFormation over Terraform if you're pure AWS. I also am a big fan of using CloudFormation just because it was what I started on. I know it got kind of a bad rap in the early days for not being as idempotent as it should have been. But CloudFormation is really, really flexible. But I also have to write a lot of Terraform or evaluate Terraform in the work that I do. So I have a great slide in my Terraform lesson, which is if you are if you're in business long enough, you're probably going to have both. You're going to have CloudFormation and Terraform, and you're going to have this thing called AWS CDK and serverless framework, which is like Node.js, Python that generates Node.js, which generates CloudFormation. So you'll have them all. Yep. Internally, I do a lot of CDK. I think CDK is kind of the next big thing. It's the right balance in this war between declarative things and programming languages. we're probably going to wrap up here. Felda's still here.
Yeah, I'm here too, Andrew.
Everybody's still here.
Yeah, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a chance to answer some questions. And we did have some trouble uploading the slides into the GoToWebinar because I know some people can't get on Discord. So I've gone ahead and created a link that they can go to be able to upload the slides. So I'm sharing that now for everybody into the GoToWebinar, just in case you weren't able to get the slides earlier from Discord. And
Sure
with
thing.
that was an awesome talk, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to both your training classes coming up, the online one and the one in Reno. I know that's going to be a lot of fun.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. Great talk today. We really appreciate you. And again, we're so happy to have you be part of our team. So
Yeah,
awesome.
Thank you. Totally glad to be here. Hope it wasn't too wild of a ride.
No, not at all.
There's just a lot here, even for a 1-hour talk. So,
Andrew, are you able to hang out in the Discord for a little bit to answer just any more questions people might have?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
I'll stay in the Discord. And like I said, DMs are always open on Twitter, and you can always shoot me an email. Always happy to chat. And please do submit your tools to the tool shed at Way West Hackin Fest.
Yes, we'll share the link for the tool shed one more time in the GoToWebinar. I mean, the Discord for everybody. But other than that, I think, Velda, do you have any last words before we wrap things up?
No last words, just thank you. Take a look at our website for Andrew's training courses as well as all of our training courses that are upcoming. And don't forget to come join us at Wild West Hackin Fest, Way West in Reno. We're looking forward. We're really looking forward to it. So,
Awesome.
thanks again.
There are lots of questions coming in, and I just want to answer them about SIM stuff real quick on camera. Which is what does the pipeline look like for sending AWS logs to a SIM? Every SIM has their own integration. Quite honestly, I know I said this wasn't a Datadog talk, but go look at the stuff that Datadog is doing for AWS integration and make your own decision about Datadog, because the AWS integrations are definitely nice.
And on that note, thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.